as noted at the end of the last segment, General William Westmoreland, the overall commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, preferred, or sometimes called, big unit operations in fighting in Vietnam, which meant use of huge amounts of air power, armored vehicles, and other such high-tech weaponry to just overawe and use kind of blunt force trauma on the enemy. But as I said, that doesn't always work, and oftentimes doesn't work against guerrilla armies. In this case, it proved problematic again. There were plenty of American leaders who advised, without getting their way, that counterinsurgency techniques should be used. So smaller scale warfare would be more effective, at least according to some. And that may have been true. One of the most confusing elements of the war and most dangerous for American troops were what were sometimes called search and destroy missions, which you see here, and platoons or companies would often be sent out on their own into the wilderness or to find a village where it would be had been intelligence gathered that there was a Viet Cong fighting force there, or they were stockpiling weapons in a village. But they oftentimes were then taken to a spot by helicopter and then had to walk through kind of heavy underbrush. You see here, going through villages, trying to figure out who might be Viet Cong, who are innocent civilians. And there was just great pressure, as I said before. Sometimes if you were on one of these missions, trying to make contact with an enemy that was, thought to be in the area, the way you'd find out that you got to the right place is when a couple of your guys, the point man, the guy out in front, got shot and went down. Then know, okay, here they are. Here's the enemy. So these were oftentimes extremely difficult and much hated missions. The United States military did do something quite innovative here. Maybe the only thing in terms of how they used the military. There was an innovative technique, which in some ways it is kind of counterinsurgency. So this is the one area where big unit operations may have been moved away from. But Heliborne Assault, as it's sometimes called, the helicopter became a very important part of the American war effort. So, like I said in the last slide, American troops oftentimes, after getting their orders based on intelligence that either a Viet Cong battalion or a North Vietnamese regiment, whatever it was, is thought to be in this area, they would pile into mini melee helicopters and they'd be landed somewhere in a clearing or opening, and then went to find the enemy. Sometimes they didn't have to because the enemy was already there. In some of these areas, the terrain was so thick with vegetation, sometimes jungle terrain, sometimes grassland and trees, that there are only a couple or one possible landing zone, LZ as they call them, and so the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese government troops would oftentimes be already surrounding the landing zone. You could hear the helicopters coming from pretty far away as well. So there were many times where as soon as the helicopters touched down, in fact, even when they were coming down, they're already taking rounds into the helicopter off the off the metal of the helicopter, and as the soldiers jumped out, they were already taking casualties because the enemy was already there. So this did have, Heliborne Assault did have the promise of that. It did allow American troops to be mobile and to kind of move quickly from one spot to another. Effective partially because, again, as mentioned before, this was an enemy that didn't value taking and keeping terrain, territory, cities, villages. So since they moved around a lot, the helicopters allowed American troops to move from one place to another and back and forth and here and there rather rapidly. By 1968, at the height of American troop deployments in Vietnam, American leaders, both political and military, the Johnson administration, Johnson himself, Westmoreland, the big leaders, and the media sometimes parroting what the government had said, what was saying. They were telling Americans that the enemy, the communists in Vietnam, are about ready to crack. We're getting close. We're winning, and it looks like the end is in sight. And just as sort of they got to the height of such statements, not everyone bought that, by the way, but many people did. But they were certainly disabused of the notion when, at the beginning of 1968, in the Tet Offensive, Chinese New Year, there was a large-scale series of attacks coordinated about the same time. On the map here, you see these red splotches. All of those are places where the Viet Cong attacked, basically at the same time. And initially, they took almost all of their objectives and drove American troops out. Most, maybe shockingly to Americans, and you see it in the picture on the left, that the Viet Cong took over at least portions of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Here you see military police, American military police, actually shooting back in to the embassy compound, shooting at enemy soldiers who had taken, again, part of it in some of the buildings. So they didn't take the entire embassy, but this doesn't happen to American embassies. So when this hit the news in the U.S., Americans, were not only concerned, but now even more anxious and doubtful about what they were being told by their government, by their military, because they'd been told just before this series of attacks that the war was almost over. This makes it clear that the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese communists, were far from finished. Just to be able to coordinate attacks all across the country from north to south required enormous logistics and support of a huge population of not just soldiers, but of average people helping to supply them and feed them, house them, etc. So this made it clear that the claims by the U.S. government were nonsense, either lies, or probably more often bad information or wishful thinking on the part of American leaders. In the end, militarily, most of these red splotch areas were taken back by U.S. troops. So from a military perspective, it can and usually is said that the Americans won the Tet Offensive. But the main point of it, from the point of the Vietnamese communists, was to send a political message to the United States. And so they clearly won the political battle, which is what they were trying to do, even if they lost in the end the military battle. What they wanted to do is sow the seeds of more dissension in the American public. They knew, because it was world news, that by 1968 the war was dividing America, and it was becoming increasingly chaotic in American society. So huge protests on college campuses. One giant one the year before this in front of the Pentagon. Sometimes they got violent. So this was designed, this series of attacks known as the Tet Offensive was designed by the Vietnamese communists mainly to win a political victory, not so much to win an overall military victory. And that's what happened. There's a lot of enduring images in pictures, photographs, film from this war, all of which show what a brutal, vicious war it was. In the bottom left, a famous picture of children running away from napalm after their village was bombed by in a B-52 raid. In the lower right, a South Vietnamese government officer shooting a Viet Cong prisoner at point blank range, executing him. And so the war was the first war in American history, and really the only one, because it kind of this caused the U.S. government to change its ways. But this was the most open war to the United States press in American history. So these photographs are a good example of that. After that, the U.S. Decided in later wars, well, we're going to give the press, reporters, information, but maybe not access to everything. Also in 1968 came news of something that was known or became known as the Lai Massacre, and this certainly added to the anger about the war at home, gave anti-war protesters a lot more fuel to add to their already burning fire of protest and opposition to the war, and caused many Americans to further doubt why the United States was there, whether or not this war was worth it, whether or not we were actually doing the right thing or the wrong thing. This on top of the Tet Offensive, which sent those messages already anyway, and now this on top of that, kind of like a 1-2 punch. A company of American soldiers was sent in to check reports that a Vietnamese village was stockpiling weapons, or the Viet Cong were stockpiling weapons there, and the lieutenant in charge, Lieutenant Calley was his name, for whatever reason ordered his men to round up villagers, women, children, old people, and take them sort of outside the village ditch you see here, and shoot them execution style. Dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And this just isn't supposed to happen in the United States military. It does appear that Lieutenant Kelly didn't have orders to do this, that he did it as sort of a stray officer, though that's not entirely clear. But nonetheless, this is not supposed to happen. There were a few Americans on the scene, one helicopter pilot that was trying to stop, but he landed his helicopter at one point between the villagers and American soldiers and tried to get them to stand down, but it didn't work that way. And there's always been speculation that this was just the one massacre that went public and made it into the news, because even here it took great dedication by one particular reporter or journalist who became famous for this to get this story sort of out in the public, to get the networks to run it. So had it not been for his tireless efforts, this might not even have become public. But as one source said, some soldiers would later testify that it was not unique, but commonplace to the way America fought the war. My Lai was a real massacre, the sort of thing Americans were used to seeing in old war movies about the Nazis. So there has been some thought, though I don't think it's proven, that this wasn't the only such incident. If so, it's frightening. Here we see President Johnson. The picture on the left, one of many that show him kind of in agony over the war. The war did drive him to greater and greater anxiety and depression. He is responsible for much of what happened. In the end, most of it sort of lands on his plate. But he didn't want to fight this war. He felt he had to for various reasons, and it did bother him. You can see it in many photos. In this particular photo, he's listening to his son-in-law, who you can see at the bottom right of the picture, kind of old reel-to-reel tape. His son-in-law was sending him an audio recording. His son-in-law was in Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson is listening to him talking about what's going on in his unit, and the president's kind of breaking down under the pressure. He's shocked. Johnson shocked the country and the world when, in the middle of all this, he went on the news one night and live told the American public that he was not going to seek a second term as president, that he would serve out his term that he was elected for, but that he wouldn't run for, he wouldn't seek the nomination of the Democratic Party again. So he basically retired, and it's not entirely clear why, but it's, I think, almost certain that most or all of it was because of the Vietnam War, which was grinding his presidency and his own person down on a daily basis. By 1968, or almost daily basis, protesters regularly were outside the White House. One of the most famous chants, and he certainly heard about this if he didn't actually hear it from inside the White House, but one of the chants was, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" LBJ, of course, was his initials, Lyndon Baines Johnson. "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" So that kind of thing, I think, did wear him down, and he felt he couldn't go on as president. Tragic into a presidency, because we saw in another unit that he had achieved a great deal in terms of domestic policy. How well all those programs work domestically is open to question, but it's hard to question, I think, the importance of things like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Secondary Education Act, the Hart-Celler Act, which is the immigration bill that opened immigration back up again. So he'd had quite a domestically successful presidency, and Vietnam kind of dragged it back down. He's not considered usually one of the great presidents, one of the better presidents, mainly because of this. There was a growing anti-war movement at home, really started to pick up major steam in 1967, maybe reached kind of its apex in 1968. Lots of protests on college campuses. On the right, you see the famous one in front of the Pentagon, which I mentioned before, one in the middle on the Capitol Mall, and anti-war protesters grew in number as the war dragged on. It looked like there was no end in sight. More American casualties, were coming back in, boxes, and more was being spent on the war. In the end, about 57,000 American soldiers were killed in the Vietnam War. So this kind of turmoil was seemingly tearing American society apart. In 1970, the unthinkable happened, at least in this country, but protesters at Kent State University in Ohio were opened fire on by the National Guard of that state, killing 4 college students and wounding 9. That was a peaceful protest and demonstration, and things got out of control, and the troops opened fire. So a tragedy, but a clear sign that the country wasn't right, that there was deep division and deep fear, kind of on both sides. Keep in mind, and I said this about the 1960s in general in class, but when we say that the Vietnam War is controversial, of course we're saying that there were Americans who vehemently supported the war and Americans who hated the war. So we tend to focus on the anti-Vietnam War protesters, as well we should. We should keep in mind that there was a large contingent of Americans that protested, sometimes in favor of the war, and waving banners that said we support our president and we support our troops, and on and on. Of course, it's quite well known today that by this time, when American soldiers were coming back from a tour of duty in Vietnam, they were often treated terribly by Americans who were against the war, particularly the protesters themselves, the activists themselves. Sometimes soldiers were spit on, had things thrown at them, were yelled at and cussed at, called baby killers, which is quite unfortunate, since the soldiers themselves, as a whole anyway, can't be blamed for risking their lives for their country, even if the government can be blamed for sending him into a bad war, sending him to a war where America was on the wrong side or committing immoral acts. That's of course all arguable, but you can't argue that side certainly and make a good case for it. As I said at the outset of this unit, I do think, however, you can make a case that the United States was justified in at least trying to keep communism at bay in South Vietnam, partially to reassure allies that could be a problem in the future if not reassured, and to fight the Cold War and try to stop the spread of communism. American leaders, I think, were pretty straightforwardly of the belief that this was necessary to stop more of Asia and more of the world from falling to communism. What President Eisenhower called the domino theory. Once one country goes down, then the others nearby are likely to go down to communism as well. Not many Americans or scholars would justify this war now. A few do, and I'm somewhat agnostic. I think you can make a case on both sides, which I try to do on most issues. Another sign of the turmoil in the country, a seeming sign that the country was coming unglued, is the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968, also mentioned earlier. But you can see from the scenes here, many photographs like this, where all hell broke loose at this. And it was because of anti-war protests primarily, some other types of protests too, but primarily anti-Vietnam War. And there was some violence, as you see, and police sort of brutal tactics in response to the protesters, but they certainly, at least some of them, were prodding and poking at the authorities, almost daring them to, strike out. So this had sort of bad blood on both sides. I think even with all the anti-war protests and a growing number of Americans involved in the anti-war movement as activists, or polls that show that more Americans are turning against the war, I don't think it was until major and prominent figures, prominent Americans, started to come out publicly against the war or turn against the war, that it really there was really a chance that America would get out of the war. When powerful people start to criticize a war, it tends to carry a lot more weight with the government than when just sort of masses of citizens do. They both, I think, contributed to America getting out of the war. Public opinion, the mass protests in the anti-war movement, but I would argue that this is more important. Senator William Fulbright in the left, mover and shaker in the Senate, senator from Arkansas, who came out against the war. Walter Cronkite in the middle, the CBS Evening News anchor, the most trusted and loved journalist and TV personality in America at the time, maybe ever. He actually went on the air one night in the middle of all this and said on his broadcast, "What the hell is going on in Vietnam?" I think this photo is a famous one where he's earlier, that was not about Vietnam. He was breaking the news of President Kennedy dying just before, with tears in his eyes. Nonetheless, he had similar sort of emotional kind of outbreaks over Vietnam. On the right is Defense Secretary McNamara, who didn't come out publicly against the war, but he did actually within the cabinet as Defense Secretary by 1968 at the latest, I think 1967. He started to argue in front of the cabinet and the president that the war couldn't be won, that we thought it could be, but either it was never possible, we were wrong, or it's not possible now, which is saying something because, as I said also before, he was one of the major architects of this war, one of the most gung-ho and optimistic figures and leaders who thought this war could and would be won. So when he defected, it forced him by the way, to step down as defense secretary because President Johnson basically didn't want to hear it at that point. But with his resignation, even though he didn't say it, it was, I think, pretty clear why he resigned. And so his being ousted or stepping down from his cabinet position also sent a message, I think, to the rest of America and to the media, etc. So McNamara came to believe the war couldn't be won. Fulbright wrote a book in 1966 called The Arrogance of Power, and he was talking about the arrogance of American power. So a big name power broker of a senator coming out vocally against the war, or even writing a book talking about it. This gentleman, David Shoup, had been the Marine Corps Commandant from 1960 to 1963 and won the Medal of Honor in World War II. He also came out publicly against the war as well. And when you have a Marine that went to the top of the Marine Corps coming out and saying this, that's not good for the war effort, at least for those that are supportive of it. The government who's trying to continue American support, bolster Americans' support for the war. This isn't a good sign. So like I said, it's when people like this start to come out against the war, I think that it was doomed, that America was basically bound to have to leave, though it didn't happen immediately. Cronkite, we already mentioned. What the hell is going on? Well, many academics came out against the war. During the 1960s, a school of thought amongst scholars, social sciences, and humanities that became known as the New Left was a kind of block of academics very critical of the war. Maybe none more so than the now famous MIT professor Noam Chomsky, who was a revolutionary figure in the field of linguistics, still a big name there, still alive, basically retired now. But he, after the war, he basically launched a kind of a second career where he wrote many, many books, not about linguistics, but about American foreign policy, American capitalism, the American media, all of which he was savagely critical of. Chomsky came from New York and Philadelphia, from a Jewish background and family, but he's sort of ever since been kind of known as America's greatest critic from within. He doesn't usually have any positive things to say, even now, about the U.S. government, the U.S. military, and its interventions for sure. So, but he was becoming a pretty big academic name. And he went out publicly, against the war, as other academics did as well. So with all of these defections by prominent, famous people, this, I think, doomed the war in the end. In 1971, by this time, President Nixon was in office. The story of the Pentagon Papers broke. This gentleman on the left, Daniel Ellsberg, was a government employee, really an analyst, kind of a think tank guy. He worked for a number of departments of the government. One of these brilliant intellectuals that is paid, to analyze sometimes top secret, issues and things going on, particularly in foreign policy. He had access to a study that Robert McNamara, when he was still Defense Secretary, had done through the Defense Department. They did this secret, massive study of the war, and it's from that study primarily that McNamara came out against the war and thought we can't win it. But they kept it secret and didn't go public. Ellsberg, who had security clearance, started to read it and came to believe that it was so different, the report, what was really going on in Vietnam was so different from what the public was learning through the government and through the media, that it was his duty to get that information out to the public. But those documents were top secret, right? And he wasn't supposed to leak them. He actually started smuggling them out in like folders and briefcase, whatever it was, kind of little stacks at a time, and photocopying them and bringing them back in the next day. It took him, I don't know, weeks, months, what it was. And when he was finally finished, because the documents, it was huge. It was like boxes stacked all the way to the roof on one wall of his apartment. That's how big the study by the Pentagon or Defense Department was. And Ellsberg then gave the story to the New York Times, the Washington Post, but the U.S. government, Nixon administration, challenged it and took them to court, saying you can't release these documents, this study, because it'll jeopardize operations in Vietnam, and it's top secret. You can't do it. But the Supreme Court decided that Ellsberg could do this. The Times and Post could publish them. It's just that they also said that Ellsberg could be prosecuted after the fact. And both of those happened. As you can see, the headlines of the New York Times here, they did publish excerpts from this that did yet again cause the public to increasingly, even more so than before, mistrust their government, believe they were being lied to, because to some degree they were, and so forth. And Ellsberg did get put on trial, and probably would have gone to prison otherwise, but he lucked out because right in the middle of his trial, the Watergate scandal broke. And it was found that the Nixon administration, among their many dirty tricks and illegal acts, had broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office at one point, a group known as the Plumbers, who did these kind of break-ins for the Nixon administration, and dug out records on his psychiatric history, trying to discredit him. So when that went public as one of many dirty tricks by the Nixon administration, the government dropped the case against him just out of embarrassment, because if this guy's name stayed in the news, the Nixon administration's dirty doings would also stay in the news, which they did anyway. But this part of it went away somewhat.